Okay, so now I want to talk about physically based rendering, what it means and why it's so important to modern computer graphics. Here's a good example from Marmoset of a really cool looking physically based rendered camera lens that looks photorealistic, even though this is a model that could work real time in a video game. The term physically based rendering, although has been around for a little while, was primarily popularized by the book Physically Based Rendering from 2014 by Matt Farr, Greg Humphreys, and Pat Hanrahan. This is fairly new. If we think about 2014, that's not that long ago that this was a new idea and a new set of tools. And in fact, it's not necessarily a rule or a technology so much as a set of conventions. What it is, what makes PBR so special, is it accounts for light. Now, as opposed to earlier modeling techniques, we know so like this is a good example, this lens, at all these different lighting conditions looks different, and it looks appropriate to the lighting conditions because it actually factors light in. PBR uses lots of 2D texture maps, whereas previously with our treasure chest, we learned how to make sort of these flat color maps to show color on a surface. We also were working with some of these other ones like metalness, gloss or roughness, and our normal map. All of these maps provide different information to tell the computer how light should behave on this surface. With the normal map reflecting light off at an angle, metalness demonstrating where this object is metal or non-metal in this particular area, and gloss saying how diffuse is this surface, how much is it going to scatter light, and the albedo having no shadow in it, no highlighting, no bevels or edges, just purely what is the basic color that's under this surface. So we know that light works by having white light generally from a most common object, the sun, reflecting onto it, and something like a red apple is going to absorb all of the other spectrum of light, but instead reflect back redness to our eyes. Light doesn't exist in the object, it exists in its reflection, it exists in the light itself. And this reflection is what physically based rendering is based off of. This is why the normal direction of our object is so important, because what happens is a ray is cast from a light source, it hits the surface, and then they calculate the angle of incidence based on the normal. And then they say, okay, if this is the angle here, then that same angle for back there. This is the core of how physically based rendering works. Previous methods of rendering shaders was primarily concerned with what color the surface is. This one is actually asking how much light is coming off of it. That's what makes it so different and why it looks so much more realistic. It's actually thinking about the behavior of light instead of trying to think about objects as if we were painting them with a paintbrush. So a good example of this is that diffusion. Roughness is maybe one of the most important parts of PBR because if something has a low roughness, so this is an example from Substance Painter, we see it's really shiny and it can reflect off the surface because the incident ray bounces very evenly. But if it has a rougher surface, then when it hits, it bounces and diffuses out, as we call it, making it rougher or giving it the impression that it's got a harsher or not as smooth surface. This is all over the place. There's lots of different ways of looking at it, including thinking not just about how it reflects off the surface, but what's called subsurface scattering, things like skin and jade and clay, notoriously hard to render because our skin is actually multiple layers that trap light and reflect it. It's one of the reasons human skin is hard to replicate because it actually kind of has an iridescence to it. And so you might have heard the term subsurface scattering before, and what that is trying to simulate on the material that there is some thickness to it that light can pass through and reflect back out. But more than anything, as I mentioned, roughness is probably the most important element in PBR because it determines what's happening to the light and how will it scatter. So here's an example of the mud and the water here have the same albedo color. They have very similar features in metalness. They're both non-metallic, but their roughness is very different, or in this case, gloss. So the mud is 16% glossy and the water is 100% glossy. And you can see from the same lighting what an incredible difference that makes in how we interpret the surface of this object. This glossiness is meant to understand microscopically what's happening on the surface. So even though a surface that might be diffuse, you might run your hand over it and say it's relatively smooth, it doesn't have to be jagged or rough. It has all of this little micro detail that makes the light diffuse out in many, many directions. It's also important for us to think about how this material is put together. they are metallic and dielectric materials that behave and reflect light very differently depending on the unique properties of metal. So this is the idea, you'll hear me use this term a lot, is Fresnel, which is an edge reflection. Usually we refer to Fresnel in 3D graphics as the little white band on the corner of any object. Like I take this book here, I don't know how well this will show up, but there's like a little white line that highlights something as it just catches your eye and bounces the light straight back into your face. However, when you look straight on it, it's not nearly as reflective. Think about water. If you look at water straight out across a lake, it's almost a perfect mirror reflection of the other side of the lake. But if you look straight down into it, you're mostly a shadow and you see into the water. Why is that? Well, because when we're looking straight at the object, it doesn't reflect light back at us. Well, how do mirrors work? Well, that's because mirrors are metallic and they have different properties. So as we get closer to the edge of something, every object, the closer it gets to the edge, the more perfectly it will reflect the environment around it or the light around it. The closer it gets to the center, the more it loses that reflectiveness. So something like chrome, metallic and incredibly shiny, doesn't really lose that much reflectiveness. This is why mirrors, the term for making mirrors is silvering, because they literally used a silver dust liquid kind of compound on the back of a piece of glass to create mirrors. Whereas something like rubber, even a really smooth or hard rubber, is shiny here at the center, it loses almost all of its reflectiveness back at us. So we have to be able to break down an object whether it is metallic or non-metallic. This is what the metalness map does. Is it metal or is it not metal? So we think about metal in this way because metal is super reflective generally. It's part of the unique properties of metal as a material. And so when we're using the model we're going to use in this class, which is the metal roughness model, so where we have a color, a rough, a metal, and usually a normal map, the color that we want to use isn't necessarily the color you think of the metal, it's actually the color that light should be reflected from it. And usually on a scale of roughness, it's usually closer towards black, meaning it's not very rough at all, but it should be in metallic all the way to white, meaning it's purely metal. Whereas roughness, everything can be in different shades of gray of levels of roughness. Metalness should be pretty much on or off. It's either metal or it's not. It's either black or it's white. Here's a good example of a slide on albedo values and color values from Unity. That's a standard for PBR. You can actually find a ton of charts like this online to help you. So you don't have to guess. If you want to make gold, they'll tell you what color gold should be in the albedo. But what's interesting is the range that we're working with. So anything that's not a metal, we want its sort of luminosity or its value, as you recall from we were talking about colors, hue, saturation, and value. Its value should be in this range. We never want to go down this low because this section is reserved for shadows. Even like really, really dark objects like coal are still right around down here, even if we think they're purely black. And objects that we think that are purely white, like freshly fallen snow, are actually more somewhere in here. There are some objects that get pretty much all the way up to pure white, and that would be silver, again, because it's so common in things like mirrors, because it's so purely reflective. But we can see the metal objects tend to operate in this higher range. So thinking about our colors and not going too dark and not going too bright, especially with our non-metallic objects, is really important. Another feature of physically based rendering is this idea of energy conservation, something that previous shader models didn't have. So something like this very rough object here, we can see the highlight is very broad, but it's very, very dim. And as the highlight gets narrower and narrower and shinier, we understand that it's the same amount of light, but reflecting out. So this is what we're seeing when we're seeing roughness, this diffusion on the surface. Generally, this is the model we're looking at. There are two models. One is called spec glossiness, and the other one, which is probably the most commonly used in games today, and the one we'll be using in this class, is called metal roughness, which consists of a base color, a roughness map, a metalness map, and then usually some combination of these three, but almost always a normal map, which helps reflect the light off of it. When asking yourself, should it be metal or not, it's pretty much just a core question of, is it black or is it white in the metalness map? It should never be gray in almost any circumstances. It just doesn't make sense that way. Metalness, it either is or isn't metal, versus roughness is a scale or gradation. So thinking too, it's that same idea of like how our colors should be reflected out. I'm repeating a lot of these things over and over again, but one last thing I want to touch on here before I cut this off is roughness shouldn't be just one smooth color. As I said, roughness is probably the single most important thing to getting your textures looking realistic, also looking really interesting, because roughness determines how light is going to behave on that surface. See, we don't want things to be really flat. How do you make a floor look dirty? Well, some areas are rough and some areas are smooth. It gives us the concept that the dirt is distributed in the rough areas, and we want it to be sort of a mottled surface, cloudy in its texture and not super even. In fact, if you look at roughness maps, this is kind of what they look like. They almost never look like really flat colors because roughness varies so much. My mouse has a really varied roughness value that even if I rotate it, you can see it reflects areas, some areas different than others, because the oils on my hands are shinier than some other areas. And some areas where I've worn down the plastic over time has exposed a duller, rougher version of the plastic underneath its shiny exterior. It's really important for us to control this, and to make our lives and our worlds look real, we need this variation. And often this is where we include things like scratches and tiny little details. Because again, those little scratches simulate the idea that there was some dust or dirt, but someone scratched it. My wedding ring, the outside of it looks pretty rough. The inside of it's very shiny because I pull it on and off, and it's the part that's not exposed to the outside world. Whereas the outside part gets exposed to oxygen, it gets scraped and scratched against things. And so it tells a really interesting story that way. In that way, I like to think about roughness as where the storytelling happens. Where's this thing been? What has it been up to? The etching, the chipping, the details, it's all in the roughness. So that's it for PBR. It's sort of a crash course in it. Of course, like all this stuff, the best way to learn it is just put it into practice. I'll see you in the next one.